In these next two talks, we're going to be shifting gears a little bit. We've been talking about function and behavior, and we've been talking about humanism and those aspects of human factors. But for the next couple of talks, we're going to be looking at this notion of meaning in architecture. Architecture as a medium for communication. How do we communicate ideas? How do we communicate qualities? How do we use architecture as a way to communicate messages in our society? We have probably never had a culture on the face of the globe that was more about visual communication than we are in the 21st century. We're an extremely visual culture, and that's partly because all of you grew up with not just magazines and print illustrations and television and movies, but now, of course, the incredible visual plethora of stuff that comes through the internet and through other online communications and social media. We're constantly communicating visually, and that's because we've got many more visual media. We've got a phone in our pocket that takes photographs, and we can constantly be sending those images out everywhere. And this has made us much more attuned to the visual world. And there's probably no aspect of all that that's more potent than video games, where video games are all about being really focused on that visual environment and noticing things and remembering things and then being able to use those as clues for maneuvering your way through the game. And it really intensifies our acuity in terms of visual observation. So I would make the argument your generation is so adept at visual communication, really much more so than previous generations. And I can tell that when I give a test. I used to give tests with a slide identification. I'd get a good bell curve. There were some crappy ones and there were some good ones and there was everything in between. These days, if I give a test of slide identification, your generation is so good at visual memory that it gets skewed way over to the high end. And I don't get a good bell curve. I get way better, higher performance than we used to get on those. And it's because you're just very good at visual communication. Now, this is something we use as a tool all the time. And we don't even think about it. It's completely unconscious. But probably most of you, when you got up this morning, I don't know, maybe you ran a comb through your hair to try to make it look a little more orderly. Maybe you mussed up your hair to make it look a little more crazy. You maybe put on some makeup. You maybe shaved. You selected some clothes to wear. And whether it's conscious or unconscious, you're communicating something with all of that. Many of you have very explicit communication in what you're wearing. You've got a Longhorn on your shirt, or you've got words on it, Keep Austin Weird on your shirt. And so there are explicit communications, but there also are communications of all sorts, even just in the way we dress. So we all do that, whether we're conscious of it or not. We all read those communications. If I walked into a class of students at UT and there was a guy student who was wearing a very nice suit and tie, polished leather shoes, that would say something about that kid. I would get a very different impression of him than other people in the class. If there was a woman in the class who came in hose and high heels and nice business suit, maybe a string of pearls, beautiful makeup, perfect hairdo, I would definitely get communication from that. I would get some idea of who that person was. We use these visual cues as ways of communicating all the time. And it's just rampant in the whole culture. Believe me, corporate America is extremely cognizant of visual communication. I went to visit the Johnson Wax building a while back. It's a Frank Lloyd Wright building. I'm there looking at the building. This guy that's showing me around says there's this one conference room you really got to see, but unfortunately there are people in that conference room. So we're just going to slip in the back and let you get a look at the conference room, and then we'll quietly come out again. So we just slip in the back, but the conference that's going on turned out to be really interesting to me too. It was probably 15 executives sitting around a big table, and in the center of the table were about 10 different versions of a can of Pledge. Pledge is the spray stuff you use to dust with. I don't even know who uses Pledge anymore. But these executives were all trying to figure out what is the new design for our Pledge can. What colors, what graphics, what's going to make it pop off the shelf, what's going to communicate that fantastic lemon scent that is so important in our Pledge. And the yellow, yes, that communicates it really well. But maybe yellow with a little green gives that sense of that lemon scent even better. But definitely not red or orange. That doesn't communicate lemon scent at all. So these executives are discussing, what is this visual communication? How do we tell people about our product just with the design of that can? And corporations are all over their logos because that's visual communication. There's a company like IBM that has had that same logo for ages. That cool blue, even the company is referred to as Big Blue because of the blue in their logo. Blocky, very technical looking letters. And that was originally International Business Machines, and they made like typewriters. But now that they're doing software and management consulting, they still have that ethos of technology, of precision, of engineering, that cool blue and those crisp technological letters communicate the ethos of that company. Even though they've changed their business model, they have not changed their ethos, and their logo communicates that. Same thing with somebody like McDonald's. And it's a completely different kind of logo. It's big, loopy, silly, yellow letters, crazy Ronald McDonald, kiddie, childish. But it's communicating what this brand is. This brand is about informality and comfort and family and relaxing, and all of that is built into just that logo, just that visual communication of McDonald's. We do it in everything, the kind of car you buy, the kind of clothes you wear, the kind of house you choose to live in, the kind of office a corporation chooses as its home. So all of this visual communication is super, super important in our culture. And if it's important in Pledge cans and clothing, then oh my God, how much more important is it in something as subsuming as the larger visual environment of a city or of a building or of these pieces of architecture. It certainly is a potent part of what we ought to be talking about. So we're going to be talking today in this talk and then in the next talk about how we communicate visually with architecture. And I'm going to make the argument that there are three different kinds of communication that we use. The first I'm going to refer to as literal direct communication. Literal direct communication. And that means that you literally see something, you're supposed to be thinking about that, and it communicates directly a message. So an example of this might be a billboard on I-35 that has a picture of a big Hereford cow, and it says, "Eat more beef." Okay, that literally is a cow. Beef is literally from a cow. And I'm supposed to think of that cow and beef. Eat more beef. That's literal direct communication. The second kind of communication I want to talk about is literal indirect communication. So that maybe I literally see an image there. I meant to think of that, but it's really meant to refer me to something else, to indirectly remind me of something else. So take that same billboard. If it had a big longhorn steer on it and it said "hook 'em horns," that is literally a cow. It's a longhorn steer, but it is not meant to make me think of cows. It's meant to make me think of the University of Texas. So it is indirectly referring me to the University of Texas. It becomes an emblem of something else. So there's literal direct communication, literal indirect communication. And then the third kind of communication is abstract communication, where now it actually is not anything literal that we're looking at. It's colors, or it's shapes, or it's textures, or it's proportions, or it's materials that communicate something. And it gives us emotional feelings. And it communicates via that kind of more abstract, emotional kind of communication. So we'll be looking at all three of those. Today we're going to be focused on literal direct communication. And how is it that, and in this case we're just going to look at one project that is all about literal direct communication. In some ways it's just the very simplest, most straightforward kind of visual communication you can imagine. So we're going to be looking at this temple precinct in India around the town of Khajuraho. And this district has about 40 or 50 Hindu temples in several different clusters in this district of Khajuraho. And they were done about 1,000 years ago. They're ancient, ancient temples. And they've been there as a real nexus for a Hindu religion for a very, very long time. This is in the freaking middle of nowhere, not near Calcutta or Bombay or Delhi, not near major cities. It's kind of out in the country. And yet it's a place where Hindu pilgrims come in large numbers to visit this sacred kind of site. Now, I have been to Khajuraho 2 times. Once when I was maybe in my early 30s, and then I went just a few years ago. I went back to India with my brother, and I just had to take him to Khajuraho because I think it's such a phenomenal thing in Khajuraho. So we made this pilgrimage out to Khajuraho. As you can see, these temples are very, very elaborate constructions. Over a period of about 100 years, they built these temples with thousands and thousands of people involved in the construction of them. They are meticulously made. They're beautifully, beautifully crafted. And they're in really magnificent condition. Oddly enough, they really don't have much interior. They do have small interior spaces, but the Hindu religion doesn't operate like the Christian religion, where you might have a large interior space where a congregation gathers. In the Hindu religion, it's a more individual thing. So there aren't large, grand interior spaces. In some ways, it's just about the communication on the exterior. It's really about the building almost as a billboard, communicating something to you about the Hindu religion. So there are many, many different of these temples, and sometimes they're kind of clustered in a precinct together. As you can see, there's elaborate carving on pretty much every surface of the temple, and it's depicting human figures and stories, and it's telling you things. It's literal direct communication about ideas of Hindu religion. Now, the first time I went to visit, I was poor, and I had gotten a car and a driver to take me out there. So in India, you don't drive yourself. You're nuts if you try to do that. And I didn't have much money, so I get this driver who has a beat-up 25-year-old black Ford, and he takes me out to Khajuraho. And because it's quite a long distance, he and I, chatted along the way. He spoke fairly good English. And he told me what he thought the meaning of Khajuraho was and what all these depictions were about. And then 30 years later, I went with my brother, and then we had a little more means to travel with, and especially when I travel with my brother. He's kind of a rich lawyer, so I got to up my game a little bit. And at that point, we actually made contact with a Brahmin who is the priest class in India, who was quite erudite and quite an expert on Hindu religion. His father was a very famous yogi, and in fact had traveled all over the world talking about Hindu religion and about yoga. But this guy certainly knew his stuff, and he told us what he thought the meaning of the temples at Khajuraho were. So I'm going to tell you both stories. And I think in some ways both stories are kind of valid, although one is probably a lot more true than the other one. But this kind of meaning can be subjective. Different people get different meanings from the same architectural forms. So according to my driver, in this first instance, this is the story of the temples and why they were built. So he said in the old days, the upper classes would send their young sons to be raised by the Hindu priest. And the Hindu priest lived in communities of male priests. They weren't prescribed to be celibate, but they were primarily celibate in these communities. And they would take these little kids when they were 3 or 4 years old, and they would raise them until they were 16 or 17 years old. And in this environment of all males, and where the priests were primarily celibate. And then they would be returned to their families at age 16 or 17, and they would have an arranged marriage. And they would be married to a woman they had never met, probably, and she might be 13 or 14 years old, and then they would consummate the marriage. But then thereafter, they would live in a house with his family. And in the household, the women would have their culture, and the men would have their culture. And except for very, very young male children, you stayed, and the young male children might be able to go in the women's area, but primarily the males and the females stayed pretty separate. So these guys had been raised in this celibate environment. They're married to someone they hardly know. They continue to live pretty separate lives. And there were, according to this driver, there were no babies happening. And this was a really bad thing, because if there are no babies happening, then the priests don't have anybody to educate. They don't have any income for their priest community. And of course, the rich people are not happy about the fact that there's not a next generation and they're not having lots of babies come around. So according to my driver, they had to fix this. And the idea was you would fix this by communicating to the young men that sexuality was not in opposition to Hindu religion. And according to my driver, before, it was seen that sexuality was maybe not so compatible with being a good Hindu. And they certainly wanted these young men to be good Hindus. But now they were wanting to communicate something different, that it was okay to be very actively sexual and to be interested in sex and procreation and the opposite sex. And you could still be a really good Hindu and have that kind of sexual activity. So the depictions in these temples are of sexuality significantly. And you get very voluptuous female depictions. And remember, this is on a Hindu temple. So it's connecting that idea of this is a temple, this is where you worship, this is the high moment of Hindu religion, but it also is compatible with sexuality. So the images all over these temples are highly sexual, and they're also about actual sexual acts, and in some ways almost how-to in various kinds of sexual acts. Sometimes it gets well beyond procreation, gets more to recreation, maybe even to athleticism here. Do not try this one at home, just a tip there. But they would depict these different acts of sex on the Hindu temple. And that, according to my driver, that was highly successful, that the young men suddenly became much more interested in sex, and they were having babies, and everybody was fine. And that was the reason, that was the communication, that was the meaning of the temples at Khajuraho. Now, when I went a number of years later, and this Brahmin, this very educated man, is telling me his interpretation of the meaning of the temples at Khajuraho. It's different, but in some ways it's also the same. So he says that Hindu religion is really, in a way, it's not a religion, it's a way of life. And there are 4 aspects of life that Hindu religion emphasizes. One is dharma, which is duty. It's very important that you're a dutiful person, you take responsibility. One is artha, which is material gain, that's wealth. And it's important that you work hard and you gain material goods. The third is kama, which is sexuality. And that, some of you may know the Kama Sutra, which is a kind of sexual guide, ancient sexual guide. But kama was the sexual side of life. And the fourth and final thing is nirvana, or salvation. So dharma, artha, kama, and nirvana, or duty, material gain, sexuality, and salvation. Those are what life is about in the Hindu religion. And so you would have temples that depict duty, and those images on them would be about being a responsible and dutiful person to your family or to your community. And there would be temples that would depict artha, which is gaining material wealth. And it would show merchants, and it would show people working in the field, and it would show, that as a very important part of life. And so it would only be natural, of course, you're going to have some temples that would depict kama, which is sexuality. And that this is what Khajuraho does. And that's what these images are all about. Now, the second time that I was there in particular, the place was just a swarm with young men and women, maybe late teens, 20s, and groups of guys and groups of women. But it's kind of a popular place to just kind of go and understand that sexuality and physical attraction. So the second time that I was here, it was a particularly popular day for visits, and there were young guys and young women, late teens, all the way through their 20s, a lot of people visiting there. Generally clusters of guys and clusters of women, and generally probably people who were unmarried, but all young people all the way, just wandering around Khajuraho. It was kind of a wonderful thing where these temples are saying, dude, maturing and having sexual feelings, and this is a part of our religion. This is a part of life. And you see them looking and pointing and giggling, and but it's meaning. And it is very much literal, direct meaning. What do I see? I see sexuality. And what am I meant to think about? I'm meant to think of sexuality. And I'm in a Hindu temple, so this is a connection between Hinduism and sexual attraction. So literal, direct communication. Very powerful for a freaking 1,000 years in this remote area of India, with thousands of people coming to visit and to receive this kind of very potent communication. Okay, see you next time.